Welcome to today's bite-sized philosophy lecture. My name is Mr. Nonfiction, or at least that's my YouTube name. And today, we're going to be talking about moral subjectivism. Now, I'm not actually a moral subjectivist myself, but if I was one, I would absolutely insist that universal moral truths are actually compatible with moral subjectivism, which is very counterintuitive for most people. But I hope this video will explain why it's actually very logical and it makes sense, and I hope you enjoy this video. Okay, so the first thing we got to do is we got to go over definitions, all right? X is a proposition. Y is the subject of X. What does that mean? Y is an existing thing, something that exists within reality, and X is a truth statement that describes Y. And so X is a proposition. Propositions can either be true or false, and Y is an existing thing within reality. Okay, so what is the definition of objective? Well, X is objective if and only if Y is mind independent. X is subjective if and only if Y is mind dependent. And what is mind independence? Well, Y is mind dependent if and only if, quote, and I got this from Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it is only the object of a mental state. That's very important, this precise wording. All right, so what's the definition of universal? Well, X is a proposition, remember. So a proposition is universal if and only if the truth of X is not contingent upon any state of affairs. So what does that mean? Well, something is universal if it's always true, no matter the context, no matter the time, and it's true for everyone. Okay, so right off the bat, it's really important to note that according to these definitions, something can be subjective and universal at the same time. And keep in mind, these are the standard definitions used in philosophy. I'm not just making up these definitions to prove a point, right? I'm not setting up a straw man for the subjectivist, right? These are the definitions used by philosophers. But when someone says that I believe that morality is subjective, I think that what they typically mean, or what they try to say, is that morality is not universal. Now, this is a completely different statement than to say morality is subjective, right? If I was to say that morality is subjective, all that would mean is that morality is mind-dependent. And as it turns out, I think that's what most people believe anyways. That's saying that if there were no conscious beings, if there were no minds, then morality would not exist. Morality exists because there are minds, right? That's essentially what this is saying. And so, according to this precise definition of subjective, pretty much most people are moral subjectivists. But, okay, well, there is a problem here. I've already said that most people define subjective as being not universal, right? And so I'm merely pointing out that the definitions that philosophers typically use, and the definition they typically use is that of the mind independence, actually goes against popular notions of what subjective morality is. I find that very interesting, and let's continue to explore that. And we have more definitions in this slide. So we're going to be exploring the concept of goodness, not to a very large extent, mostly because there's just not enough time in this video. I'm going to save that for another video, but let's begin. To keep things simple, let's say that moral goodness and moral value are interchangeable terms. Now, in a lot of spheres, that's not true. But to keep things simple, let's just assume it is. Moral goodness, or moral value, is defined as, well, in order to really define that would take quite some time, you know. something that you could write an entire book on the many philosophies that try to define goodness. It would be a very thick book, and not something that I can cover in a 10-minute video. But to keep things simple, let's just say, good is well-being and bad is suffering. And at the very least, most people can accept that well-being is a good thing and suffering is a bad thing. Now, the true subjectivist might claim that well-being is subjectively good and suffering is subjectively bad. But most subjectivists even will say that well-being is good. It's just subjectively good. And so I think it's acceptable to say this, that 99%, probably more like 99.9%, or at least an arbitrarily high percentage of philosophers would say that this is true. So well-being is good and suffering is bad. So let's move on. Well, I can't get the slides to work. Oh, there we go. Okay, so here's my argument. Okay. Subjective morality. If we use the definitions from before, right? If we use this definition of subjective, then subjective morality means that all morals are mind-dependent. As it stands, that's not really the status quo definition of subjective morality. So I suppose that, in a way, I'm setting up a straw man. Or at the very least, I'm showing how the definitions of these terms are not consistent with what they typically mean. Because what is typically meant by subjective morality is that X is good. So X is good translates to I approve of X, right? So X is good, I approve of X. And that's what subjective morality means. But like I pointed out, when you actually look at what subjective means, this is what subjective morality should mean if everything was consistent with each other. It should mean that all morals are mind-dependent. And if this is true, then that would mean that mind-dependent morality is all morals are the subject of a mental state. So at this point in time, I need to go over a concept related to this, and that is the concept of identity dependence. And that some experiences have the property of having identity dependence. Now, aside from being a fancy term that I actually made up for the purposes of this lecture, what does it actually mean? Okay, well, it means that there are some experiences that only someone who is identical to you can feel, right? And so let's say that I view the color red, and I'm looking at the color red, and the experience that I have when viewing this is only replicable in a being who is perfectly identical to me. And only that being can have the same experience that I'm having when I'm viewing the color red. Right. And so, if there's a mental state that is not identity dependent, then that would mean that someone who's not identical to me can also feel it. So I think a good example of that is just these broad experiences. And so, arguably speaking, there's something at the root of suffering, or there's something at the root of well-being. And this thing that's at the root of suffering and well-being is something that every being conscious is capable of experiencing, right? And so we can call it universal. There's something at the root of experiencing well-being that is subjective according to this definition of subjective, but it's universal, right? And that's my argument. That's what I say here. Among states of mind that are identity independent, some are morally good or bad. And remember that we define goodness as well-being and suffering is badness. So among states of mind that are identity independent, some are morally good or bad, regardless of whomever it is who is experiencing them, or whatever the state of affairs is at the time of the experience. Right? So that's essentially saying that every conscious being is capable of experiencing at least some degree of well-being or suffering. And if they're not capable of experiencing well-being or suffering, then I would say they're not conscious. And that's a highly dubious assumption. It's also an interesting assumption. It's an assumption that warrants attention. And at the very least, it's plausible. At the very most, it's probable. But it leads to my conclusion that, therefore, if all morals are subjective, remember this is our definition of subjective, if all morals are subjective, there still may be some moral principles which are universal between all conscious beings. And that is my deductive proof. Now, whether you think that's a good deductive proof, well, I'm actually not really sure that this is a good... I think it's logically valid, but, well, let's move to our limitations. So it's not the perfect argument. I think that the biggest the biggest criticism is that there's a lot of assumptions. I put that second in the bullet point for some reason. It should be the first because that's the biggest limitation. There's a hell of a lot of assumptions in that argument. Every single one of them has to be true for the argument to be sound. If we remember Occam's razor, right? So Occam's razor is the theory that has the least amount of assumptions is the one that's most likely to be true. Well, this argument has quite a few assumptions. So that decreases the probability that this argument is sound, right? Another criticism is that the argument depends on the precise definitions of all the terms, in specific subjective. Like I said before, to some degree I'm committing equivocation because I'm using subjective morality in a way that most people would disagree with, right? I'm defining the word subjective and then I'm describing morality in terms of subjective terms. And that it happens to be that when I do that, it goes against the status quo of what subjective morality is. I think that's acceptable. Other people might think that is not acceptable. Either way, I think it's okay. My argument doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't even have to be right. It just has to be interesting, and I think it's interesting. And so I'm going to leave it at that. And if you made it all the way to the end, you can pat yourself on the back. If you liked this content, then I'm going to tell you to do what every YouTuber does and subscribe. Click the little bell button if you feel so inclined. And I'm going to wrap this up. So, whoever you are that's gotten to the end of this, you have a great rest of your day or night. And I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.